Loan officer ripped black woman's application, didn't know her signature was already on the bank's deed. Remove her, the judge said, and his voice carried the particular boredom of a man who had never once doubted his own authority. This witness is wasting the court's time. Sire, the laughter had started in the jury box. Not all 12 of them, just 4, maybe 5. In the back row, the kind of low, dismissive sound that men make when they believe the room belongs to them. But it spread. It moved through the gallery like a smell. The defense attorney, a man named Gerald Cresswell, who wore his gray hair parted with surgical precision, did not laugh. He smiled, which was worse. He set down his pen, leaned back in his leather chair, and smiled at the woman standing at the witness stand the way you smile at a child who has just mispronounced a word at dinner. The woman at the stand did not move. Her hands rested flat against the wooden rail. Her eyes did not drop. She was wearing a navy blazer she had pressed that morning at 5 a.m. in a motel room 2 blocks from the courthouse, and the crease down her sleeve was still sharp enough to cut paper. She was holding a manila envelope that no one in that courtroom had bothered to ask about yet. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was the quietest sound in the room, "I have not finished." 8 minutes from now, every person who had laughed would understand exactly what they had done. Nah. They laughed at her, in federal court, with a jury watching. And she just stood there, holding that envelope. We need to talk about who this woman is, because they had absolutely no idea. Let's get into it. Her name was Celestine Morrow, and she had grown up in a house in Pritchard, Alabama, where the back porch screen door never closed all the way, because the hinge had been broken since 1987, and there was never quite enough money to fix it. She remembered the sound it made in the summer, that slap and rattle every time the wind moved the way some people remember music. Her mother, Inez, worked a double shift at the Baptist Memorial Laundry, 3 days a week and a half shift at a cleaning company the other 2. And on Saturdays she braided hair in the kitchen for $12 a head. Celestine did homework at the kitchen table while her mother's hands moved. She did it under a lamp that flickered because the wiring in the east wall had been wrong since before either of them was born. The math came easy. That was what her 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Odom, told Inez at the parent conference, leaning forward with both hands around her coffee cup like she was sharing a secret. She doesn't just compute. She sees the structure underneath. Celestine did not know what that meant at the time. What she knew was that numbers behaved honestly in a way that most things did not. You could follow them, and they would take you somewhere real. Inez had a copy of her own high school diploma in a frame above the kitchen door. The glass cracked in the lower right corner, and she had taped the crack from behind with clear packing tape so it stayed together. She had graduated from Blount High School in 1979. She touched the frame sometimes when she walked under it. A quick press of 2 fingers, the way you touch something you want to remember. Celestine won the county mathematics competition in 8th grade. She won it again in 9th, and she was the first student from Pritchard Public Schools to do that back-to-back in 11 years. The trophy was plastic and the gold paint was already chipping by the time she carried it home on the bus, but Inez held it with both hands and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Your grandfather would have driven to Montgomery for this." Her grandfather had died of a heart attack at 52, working a line job at a plant that later settled a class-action lawsuit for toxic exposure, but the settlement money had gone to legal fees, and the family had seen $37 and some change. She got into the University of Alabama on a merit scholarship in 1999. She studied mathematics and statistics. She graduated in 2003 with a 394 gigapascals. And she remembered the specific professor, a man named Dr. Alistair Pruitt, who had told her in her junior year that she might want to consider a different concentration, something more suited to her presentation, which was a phrase she turned over in her mind for years afterward, like a stone she kept finding in her pocket. She went to graduate school at Michigan anyway. She finished her PhD in applied statistics in 2009. Her dissertation was on Bayesian inference methods in forensic evidence analysis. She spent the next 4 years working for a nonprofit called the Hendricks Center for Judicial Integrity, based in Chicago, which had been founded by a retired federal judge named Miriam Hendricks to investigate wrongful conviction cases where forensic evidence had been misapplied or suppressed. Celestine was their senior statistical analyst. In 4 years, she produced analyses that contributed to the exoneration of 11 men across 7 states. 11 men who had gone into prison with their whole lives behind them and come out to find that the world had kept moving without them. She did not tell people this at parties. She did not, in fact, go to many parties. She went home at holidays to Pritchard, where Inez still braided hair on Saturdays and still touched the diploma frame on her way through the kitchen, and they sat together and watched whatever was on television. And Celestine helped her mother sort through mail and sometimes fixed the things around the house that she could fix with what was there. The case that brought her to the federal courthouse in Decatur, Alabama in March of 2018 had started 2 years earlier with a fire. The Decatur fire was what the local news called it, because local news has a way of naming disasters after the place instead of the cause. In October of 2016, a warehouse on the industrial east side of Decatur had burned for 16 hours. 3 workers had been inside. One of them, a man named Curtis Boone, got out with burns on his forearms and his neck. 2 of them did not get out at all. The fire investigators had determined within 72 hours that the cause was arson, and within 2 weeks the Decatur District Attorney's Office had charged 13 men, all black, all employees of the warehouse subcontracting operation, with conspiracy to commit arson and 2 counts of felony murder. The evidence, as the prosecution presented it, was a fire pattern analysis conducted by a man named Ronald Sipe, who held a certification from a private fire investigation institute and had worked for the DA's office for 11 years. Sipe's report concluded that the fire had multiple points of origin, which he identified as the signature of deliberate ignition. He had testified in 41 cases over his career. He had never once been successfully cross-examined on his methodology. 12 of the 13 men had been convicted at trial and sentenced to between 15 and 40 years. The 13th had accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony that he later recanted in a handwritten letter to the Hendricks Center, a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in January of 2018 and ended up on Celestine Morrow's desk with a sticky note from Judge Hendricks that said only, "Look at the burn patterns." She looked. She looked for 6 weeks, 7 days a week, in a windowless office in Chicago with 2 monitors and a desk lamp and a coffee maker that she had bought herself because the office one was always empty. She obtained Sipe's original report through a public records request. She obtained the fire investigation photographs through a second request and a follow-up letter when the first response came back incomplete. She ran the burn pattern data through 3 separate computational models. She cross-referenced Sipe's methodology against the current peer-reviewed literature on fire investigation science, including a landmark 2011 National Academy of Sciences report that had effectively discredited several of the forensic markers Sipe had relied upon. She wrote a 94-page rebuttal report. She had it peer-reviewed by 2 independent fire science researchers, both of whom signed letters certifying that her methodology met the highest standards of the field. She contacted the attorneys for the 12 convicted men. She agreed to testify. And that was how she came to be standing in a federal courtroom in Decatur, Alabama, in a navy blazer with a sharp crease and a manila envelope in her hands, while a jury laughed at her and a judge told her she was wasting the court's time. It had started the moment she walked in. She had arrived at the courthouse at 7:30 in the morning, 90 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin. She was wearing her badge from the Hendricks Center clipped to her jacket pocket. She was carrying 2 bags, the briefcase with her materials and a tote bag with her laptop. The security officer at the front desk, a man in his 50s with a sunburn on the back of his neck, looked at her badge and then looked at her and then looked back at the badge. "You here for the cleaning service?" he said. She said she was there to testify in the Decatur fire case. He made her wait 22 minutes while he verified her credentials. She stood to the side of the security desk and watched other people walk through. She watched 2 attorneys in suits wave their bar cards and walk straight through. She watched a man in a jacket that said Forensic Associates of America on the breast pocket walk through without stopping at all. She stood and waited and did not move and did not look at the clock on the wall more than twice. When she was finally cleared through, the bailiff who walked her to the witness room stopped outside the door and said, "You're the statistics lady?" And she said yes. He looked at her briefcase and said, "You got a lot of stuff for somebody who's just going to read numbers off a page." She said she had prepared a full analysis. He said, "Uh-huh," and opened the door and left her in a room with a folding table and two plastic chairs and a window that looked at a brick wall. She was called to the stand at 10:47 in the morning. Man, can we just pause for a second? She drove to Alabama. She stayed in a motel. She pressed her blazer at 5 in the morning. She submitted to a 22-minute credential check while other experts walked right through. And now she's finally on the stand and they haven't even heard what she has to say yet. Hold on. Keep watching. The prosecuting attorney was a man named Daniel Farrar, 44 years old, who had tried more than 200 cases in the Northern District of Alabama and who had a reputation in the local bar for preparation and for impatience with anything that complicated his timeline. He objected to Celestine's qualification as an expert witness on two grounds. First, that her institution was an advocacy organization rather than a neutral scientific body, and second, that her methodology, quote, relies on computational models that have not been validated in this jurisdiction. The judge, whose name was Honorable William Coates and who had been on the bench in this district for 19 years, sustained the first objection and overruled the second, and then said, in a tone that made clear he considered the whole proceeding a formality, "The witness may proceed, but I want to remind counsel that we are here to review the original verdict, not to retry the entire case." Celestine began with her credentials. She stated her name, her degree, her institution, her years of experience. She described the Hendricks Center. She said that in 4 years of work she had contributed to 11 exonerations in 7 states. That was when the laughter started in the back row of the jury box. It was the phrase, 11 exonerations, that seemed to do, it said it like a brag. One of the jurors in the back row leaned to the man next to him and said something behind his hand, and they both made that low, exhaling sound. 3 seats down, another juror smiled at the ceiling. From the gallery, 3 rows back, a man who turned out to be a local law enforcement officer who had testified in the original trial pressed his lips together in a way that was not quite a smile, but was close enough. Gerald Cresswell, the defense attorney for the DA's office, set down his pen and smiled. Judge Coates did not smile. He did something slightly different. He picked up his pen and began writing, as if whatever Celestine was saying had already been deposited into some mental folder labeled "noted" and dismissed. Then he said it, "Remove her. This witness is wasting the court's time." And Celestine said, quietly, "Your Honor, I have not finished." And she did not move her hands from the rail. What happened in the next 45 seconds determined the rest of the afternoon. The lead attorney for the 12 convicted men, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had driven from Atlanta and who had been working this case on a pro bono basis for 14 months, rose from her chair and said, in a voice that matched Celestine's for quietness, "Your Honor, the witness has presented verified credentials and is in the process of establishing the foundation for material evidence that is directly relevant to this proceeding. Opposing counsel's request to remove her constitutes interference with the presentation of exculpatory evidence in a federal review hearing, and I would request that the court allow the witness to proceed before ruling on admissibility." Judge Coates looked at Patricia Osei for a long moment. He was the kind of man who did not like to be reminded of rules in his own courtroom, but he was also the kind of man who understood, somewhere beneath the impatience, that a federal review hearing was being recorded by 3 separate transcript services and observed by 2 journalists in the back gallery. He said, "The witness may continue." The back row of the jury box went quiet. Celestine opened her manila envelope. She had 47 pages of her rebuttal analysis printed in a binder, and she had 4 separate exhibit packets, each one tabbed and labeled in the upper right corner with a case number and a date. She placed them on the wooden ledge of the witness stand in a single, unhurried motion. Then she looked at the jury, not at the back row, but at the whole box, moving her gaze slowly from left to right, and she began. She explained, "First, what fire pattern analysis is, and what it is not. She explained this in language that was precise without being condescending, because she had learned over years of testimony that condescension is the enemy of comprehension, and comprehension was the only thing that mattered in this room. She explained that for decades, fire investigators had used a set of interpretive markers, char patterns, V-shapes on walls, concrete spalling to determine whether a fire had multiple points of origin, and that the presence of multiple origin points had been understood as conclusive evidence of arson. Then she explained that the National Academy of Sciences, in a report issued in 2011 and signed by some of the most senior fire science researchers in the country, had systematically reviewed that methodology and found that many of those markers lacked scientific validity, that they were not evidence of deliberate ignition, that they were, in many cases, simply how fires burn. She said this slowly. She said it twice, in different words, because she had learned that the second time is when people hear it. Then she placed her first exhibit on the projector. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, the fire photographs from the Decatur warehouse, taken by the original investigation team in October 2016. On the right, a series of comparison photographs from controlled burn studies conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, showing accidental fires that had produced identical char patterns, identical V-shapes, identical spalling, in the absence of any accelerant or deliberate ignition. The back row of the jury box stopped moving. She walked through the data point by point. She showed Sipe's original report and placed beside it, page by page, the current scientific literature that contradicted each conclusion. She did not say Ronald Sipe was dishonest. She said his methodology was outdated. She said the science had moved and the report had not. She said that every specific marker he had cited as evidence of arson had been identified in the 2011 NAS report as an unreliable indicator, and that applying those markers as if they were definitive had produced conclusions the data did not support. Then, she placed her second exhibit on the projector. This one was harder to look at. It was a timeline. On the left axis, the dates of every conviction in the Decatur case, from the indictment in November 2016 through the sentencing hearings in April 2017. On the right, corresponding dates from the internal communications of the DA's office, obtained through a court-ordered document disclosure that had taken Patricia Osei 7 months to secure. The communications showed that Ronald Sipe had submitted a preliminary report in December 2016, 4 months before trial, in which he had flagged his own uncertainty about 2 of the origin points he later testified to as definitive. The flag was a single sentence, buried in a footnote on page 31 of a 40-page document. Further analysis recommended before final conclusions on points C and D. The further analysis had not been conducted. The footnote had not appeared in the version of the report submitted to the defense as discovery. The page with the footnote was on the projector now, and the gallery was quiet in a different way than it had been before, not the quiet of dismissal. The quiet of arithmetic adding up to something nobody wanted to look at directly. Gerald Cresswell was no longer smiling. Oh, you feel that? That footnote. That one little footnote on page 31 that somebody hoped nobody would ever find. And Celestine Morrow found it, with a public records request and 6 weeks of work at a desk with a lamp she bought herself. Nah, we're not done yet. Keep watching. Daniel Farrar objected 17 times during Celestine's testimony. He objected on relevance, on foundation, on hearsay, on methodology, on the basis that the NAS report was a policy document rather than peer-reviewed science, which Celestine corrected quietly and on the record by citing 3 peer-reviewed papers that had cited the same conclusions in journals that Farrar did not appear to have read. Judge Coates sustained 4 of the objections and overruled 13. At the lunch recess, Farrar approached Patricia Osei in the hallway and said, in a voice low enough that it should not have carried, "Where did you find her?" Patricia Osei said she had been referred by the Hendricks Center. Farrar said, "The advocacy shop." Patricia said, "The organization that has produced 11 exonerations in 7 states, yes." Farrar said nothing further and walked toward the men's room. In the hallway near the water fountain, a woman from the DA's support staff took out her phone and checked something and then put it away and did not look up. Celestine was in the witness room eating a sandwich she had packed that morning. She had a bottle of water and a legal pad, and she was going over her notes for the afternoon session with a pen, making small marks in the margins. Her hands were steady. Outside the window that looked at the brick wall, it had started to rain. When the afternoon session began, Celestine presented her third exhibit. This one was not a chart or a photograph. It was a document, and Patricia Osei had worked for 7 months to get it. It was an internal memorandum from the DA's office, dated 6 days before the Decatur trial had begun, in which a supervising attorney, not Farrar, someone above Farrar, had summarized a meeting about the state of the forensic evidence. The memo read, in relevant part, that the origin point analysis had limitations that would become problematic under aggressive cross-examination, and recommended that the defense receive only the finalized report rather than the preliminary drafts. There was a signature at the bottom of the memo. The supervising attorney's name was Martin Holloway. Martin Holloway was currently the Deputy District Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. He was, at this moment, sitting in the gallery of this courtroom. He had been there all morning. His name had not been mentioned before now. Patricia Osei read the exhibit number into the record. She read the memo's date. She read the recipient line. She said, Your Honor, I would also note for the record that the signatory of this document, Deputy District Attorney Martin Holloway, is present in the gallery today. The room turned. Slowly, the way a room does when it suddenly wants to look at something it did not expect to be asked to look at. Martin Holloway was a large man with a gray beard and a heavy watch on his left wrist. He did not move when the room turned. He sat with both hands on his knees and looked at the bench and did not turn back. Judge Coates set down his pen. He looked at the exhibit on the projector. He looked at Patricia Osei. Then he looked at Martin Holloway in the gallery, and in 19 years of sitting on this bench he had learned to keep his face still, and he kept it still now. But something shifted behind his eyes that everyone in the room could see, even if no one could have named it precisely. He said, Counsel, I'm going to need a brief recess. The recess lasted 28 minutes. When the session resumed, Judge Coates had 2 additional clerks at his bench and a court reporter who had been brought in from a different room. He also had, it would later emerge, spent part of the recess on a phone call with a federal judicial oversight contact in the 11th Circuit. None of this was visible in the room. What was visible was that when he returned to the bench, he did not look at Daniel Farrar for the first several minutes. Patricia Osei requested permission to call one additional piece of evidence into the record, a digital file, authenticated by a chain of custody document, containing audio recordings from the internal communication system of the Decatur DA's office. The recordings had been preserved by an IT department employee who had flagged them to an internal whistleblower system in 2017, and who had contacted the Hendricks Center after the whistleblower report was filed, and then quietly shelved. The employee's name was in the chain of custody document. He was present in the building, in a waiting room on the 2nd floor, having been driven there from Birmingham that morning by a retired federal marshal who was a personal contact of Judge Miriam Hendricks. Celestine had not analyzed the audio recordings. That was not her expertise. Her expertise was the statistical analysis of the forensic evidence. But the recordings, 11 minutes and 42 seconds of audio from a meeting in October 2016, 6 weeks before the trial, corroborated, in voice, what the suppressed memo had established in writing, that the people who prosecuted 12 men knew the foundation of their case was uncertain and had made choices about what to share and what to keep back. Judge Coates admitted the recordings into evidence. Daniel Farrar did not object. Gerald Cresswell, who had not spoken in over 2 hours, gathered his papers and placed them in his briefcase in a slow, methodical way, like a man preparing for weather. In the 3rd row of the gallery, in an aisle seat, a woman sat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Her name was Inez Morrow. She had driven up from Pritchard that morning in a car that Celestine had rented for her, starting at 4 a.m., stopping once for coffee at a gas station outside of Birmingham, where she had asked the young woman behind the counter to pray for her daughter, and the woman had said she would. Inez was 71 years old. She was wearing the blue dress she had bought for Celestine's PhD graduation in 2009, which still fit because Inez had maintained what she called the discipline of not having options, meaning she ate what she could afford and no more, and walked everywhere that was walkable, Her hands were pressing flat against her thighs, because that was how she held herself when she needed to stay still. She had not spoken to Celestine since they had eaten breakfast together that morning in the motel room, sitting on the edge of the bed with containers of yogurt and coffee from the lobby, and Inez had said, "You know what you're doing." It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that is actually a prayer. She had been in this gallery since 9 o'clock in the morning. She had heard the laughter from the jury box. She had watched her daughter's hands remain flat on the witness stand rail. She had pressed her own hands flat against her thighs and breathed. Now the room was different, and she breathed differently too. Judge Coates spoke for 12 minutes before he issued his ruling. He spoke about the obligation of the court to the integrity of the evidence on which convictions rest. He spoke about the relationship between the prosecution's duty of disclosure and the constitutional rights of the accused. He referenced the NAS report. He referenced the suppressed memo. He referenced the audio evidence. He did not raise his voice. He issued an order vacating the convictions of all 12 men. Not 11, not 10. All 12. He also ordered an immediate administrative review of the Ronald Sipes prior testimony in every case he had worked for the Northern District DA's office over the previous 11 years. 41 cases. The review was to be conducted by an independent forensic science panel, 3 members minimum, none of whom were to be selected by the DA's office. He also issued a notice requiring Martin Holloway to make himself available for interview by the Federal Judicial Review Board within 14 days, on the basis of the memorandum that had been entered into evidence. He did all of this in 12 minutes, in a voice that had not changed volume from the beginning to the end. The courtroom was quiet, not the quiet of dismissal, a different kind. Patricia Osei was writing notes on her legal pad. She was writing fast, and her handwriting was getting larger the faster she went, which was a thing that happened to her when she was trying to hold more than her hand could keep up with. Celestine stood at the witness stand and waited until the ruling was complete. Then she gathered her exhibits in the order she had placed them and returned them to their packets and clipped the packets together and put them in her briefcase. She did this slowly and completely. When she was done, she looked at the bench. "Your Honor," she said, "I have nothing further." She walked back to the table. She sat down next to Patricia Osei. Patricia put one hand on her forearm for a moment and then took it back and kept writing. In the gallery, Inez Morrow pressed both palms flat against her chest and tilted her head back and looked at the ceiling, and 2 tears ran down the sides of her face simultaneously, as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment to move. 3 days later, in a press conference organized by the DA's office under advice from its legal counsel, Gerald Cresswell read a statement that had clearly been written by someone else and revised several times. The statement said, in its relevant portion, that the office acknowledges the concerns raised by the statistical review and recognizes the determination of the analyst whose work contributed to this outcome. He did not say Celestine's name. He used the word determination. He used it the way you set something down carefully on a table because you know if you drop it, it makes a sound. He was asked by a reporter from the Decatur Daily whether he had anything to say to the 12 men who had spent between 14 and 17 months in prison awaiting a review that had been pending since 2017. He said, "We respect the court's ruling." He was asked if he wanted to add anything. He said, "I think the statement speaks for itself." He gathered the statement from the podium and walked away from the microphones and did not look at the cameras as he went. Daniel Farrar did not appear at the press conference. Martin Holloway placed himself on administrative leave that same morning, pending the Federal Review Board investigation. The investigation, it would later be reported, found sufficient evidence to refer the matter for potential criminal prosecution. That referral was made in the fall of 2018. Ronald Sipes' certification was suspended by the private institute that had issued it, pending review. The review of his 41 prior cases, conducted by the independent forensic panel over the following 18 months, identified problematic methodology in 23 of them. 14 of those cases were referred for further examination. 6 men were released in the 14 months that followed. That brought Celestine's total to 23. She did not hold a press conference. She sent a brief statement to the Decatur Daily through the Hendricks Center's communications office. The statement said that the work was not hers alone. that it belonged to the attorneys and the investigators and the men who had maintained their innocence long enough for the system to be forced to look at them again, and that the only question that had ever mattered was whether the evidence supported the conviction. She drove back to Pritchard the weekend after the ruling and helped her mother sort through a leaking section of the back porch. They fixed it with materials from a hardware store on the main road. They worked for 3 hours in the afternoon. Her mother made tea when they were done, and they sat on the now solid porch and drank it and did not talk about the courthouse for a while. Hold on. 6 men. 6 more men. From the review of Sipes' 41 prior cases, we're up to 23 now. That one woman, with one envelope, sitting in a motel pressing her blazer at 5 in the morning, 23 men walking free because she did not move her hands off that rail. I need you to sit with that for a second before we keep going. The 12 men who had been convicted in the Decatur fire case were released between March and May of 2018, as the paperwork cleared each of their cases individually. They came out at different times, from different facilities, but they were met in each case by some combination of family and by Patricia Osei, who drove to every release. Curtis Boone, the man who had survived the fire with burns on his forearms and neck, was released on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the parking lot of the correctional facility for 4 minutes before he could make himself walk toward the car. His daughter, who was 11 years old and had been 4 when her father went to prison, held his hand and did not let go of it while he stood there. One of the 12 men, a man named Vincent Alcott, who had spent 17 months inside and had been a junior supervisor at the warehouse before the fire, used part of his civil settlement to enroll in a technical certification program in HVAC systems. He completed it in 9 months and started his own business. He named it Alcott Climate Systems. It employed 4 people within its first year. The civil settlements reached by the 12 men collectively totaled $4.2 million, paid by the county after 18 months of negotiation. 11 of the 12 men retained a portion for their families. One of them, a young man named Desmond Fitch, 26 years old at the time of his release, who had been 24 when he went in and who had spent 18 months reading in his cell because there was not much else to do, and who had read, among other things, everything he could find about wrongful conviction cases, donated his entire settlement to a fund. He named it the Fitch Evidence Fund. Its stated purpose was to provide statistical and forensic analysis resources to defendants in cases where the original forensic evidence was potentially unreliable and where the defendant lacked the resources to challenge it independently. The Fitch Evidence Fund's first grant recipient was the Hendricks Center for Judicial Integrity. Celestine Morrow was not informed of the donation in advance. She learned about it in an email from Judge Miriam Hendricks, who wrote only, "Read the attached press release, then call me." She read it. Then she sat at her desk for a while without doing anything else. And the 2 monitors were on, and the desk lamp was on, and the coffee maker behind her was making its noise. And she sat and looked at the press release and read it twice. Then she called her mother. Inez picked up on the second ring. She always picked up on the second ring, which she said was because the first ring was for finding the phone and the second was for answering it. Celestine told her about the fund. Inez was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's the boy's name?" Celestine told her. Inez said, "I'm going to remember that." The way she said it, it meant she was going to say it in her prayers, which she said every night, which was something she had done since before Celestine was born. In the fall of 2019, the University of Alabama's Law School established a joint program with its statistics department for training forensic statistical analysis. The program was called the Evidence Integrity Project. It accepted its first cohort of 8 graduate students in January of 2020. The program's founding advisory board included 3 law professors, 2 fire science researchers, 1 retired federal judge, and 1 senior statistical analyst from the Hendricks Center for Judicial Integrity, whose name appeared 4th on the list, below the retired judge and above the fire science researchers. The security officer at the front desk of the Decatur Federal Courthouse retired in the summer of 2018. His replacement, a younger woman who wore her badge on a lanyard and had a visible tattoo of a compass on her left wrist, processed visitors through in the standard order, badge verification, sign in, proceed. She was fast, and she was even-handed, and she did not ask anyone what they were there for unless it was relevant to the process. The diploma above Inez Moro's kitchen door, the one from Blunt High School in 1979 with the packing tape holding the cracked corner together, came down in the summer of 2019, when Celestine drove to Pritchard with a new frame she had ordered from a framing shop in Chicago. It was not fancy. It was a clean, dark wood with a real glass front, and it fit the diploma exactly. They put it back above the kitchen door together, Celestine on the step stool and Inez steadying the nail, and when it was straight, they stepped back and looked at it, and Inez reached up and touched it with 2 fingers the way she always had. The quick press of contact. The thing you do to something you want to remember. The back porch screen door had a new hinge. All right. I need to take a breath after that one. For real. Because this is the kind of story that makes you feel something you don't always get to feel, which is the feeling of the math being right. Of the numbers actually adding up to something just. Celestine Moro walked into that courthouse with an envelope and 6 weeks of work at a desk with a lamp she bought herself. She stood on that stand while people laughed. She did not move. She did not raise her voice. She just waited until she could show them what she had. Now, this story is inspired by real patterns in real cases, cases where wrongful convictions have turned on suppressed evidence, flawed forensic methodology, and the quiet, sustained work of people who refused to stop counting until the numbers told the truth. The specific names, the specific courthouse, the specific people in this story are fictional. But the silence of the bystanders is real. The suppressed footnotes are real. The men reading in their cells are real. The mother touching the diploma frame is real. So here's what I want to ask you. If you were in that jury box when the room went quiet, what would you have done with that silence? Leave your answer in the comments. Because the people in that gallery who sat still and went home and said nothing, that's its own kind of verdict, and I think you know that. If this story stayed with you, hit like so more people find it. Share it with someone who needs to see that numbers don't care who writes them. And if you're not subscribed yet, do that now, because we come back here every week, and every week we find another story where somebody picked up an envelope nobody thought mattered. We'll see you next time. Let's get into it.